Thank you very much for talking to the Voice of America.
Thank you.
Hossein Rouhani is visiting Europe. This is his first visit, and it's the first visit of an Iranian president since 1999. Should the Europeans trust Mr. Rouhani now, and also trust Iran?
Boy, that is a tough question. Mr. Rouhani is certainly the friendly face of a regime that is a significant violator of human rights, that continues to develop ballistic missiles, that continues to have an aggressive stance and abuse rights not only at home but also in the region, in the Syrian civil war, more broadly in the Middle East in a number of countries. So there are real reasons to doubt whether the friendly face that Mr. Rouhani presents to Europe represents Iran all the way through.
I'm going to go back, if I may, I'm going to come back to all the points that you've mentioned, but let's talk about France. They were, during the P5+1 negotiations and on the nuclear deal, France was quite outspoken and they took a hard line towards Iran. And they are also very outspoken about their criticism and condemnation of Iran's support of the Assad regime. Yet Mr. Rouhani is in France, or will be in France in 2 days, and France was the first one to greet him. What are your thoughts on that? What's your take on that?
France historically is an important country for Iran, and there's a long history. France, of course, has stood up for human rights, for universal rights, and gave Ayatollah Khomeini a home when he was exiled from Iran. And it was there that much of the leadership of the revolution was based before 1979. And France is an important country for the Iranian diaspora. It was also, of course, the home of former Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, who himself was assassinated in Paris, and home to a significant exile population, exiles who were more modern, represented the more modern, more secular side of Iran for the past few decades. And France, unlike the other Western countries, had continued diplomatic relations with Iran. And so, France had had a harder line during the P5+1 negotiations because the French diplomats in particular were skeptical of Iranian promises of Iran dragging negotiations out, of Iran tiring out negotiation partners, which France had felt that it had been a part of. And so France is critical to Iran, and I think that France is in the midst of a major economic slowdown, heading into a presidential election in 2017, and as much as President Hollande had the hardest line in the West against during the negotiations, and as much as Foreign Minister Fabius spoke out, criticized the regime, France now is worried that it's going to lose out at the economic negotiating table, and so it is in Iran's interest to try to bring France along, to cut as many economic deals as possible in the hopes of creating employment in France that will be dependent on Iran. There was a long economic relationship with French automobiles being manufactured in Iran, and a long history of economic cooperation that Iran has an interest in playing upon and hope to rebuild.
With what you mentioned about the economic relationship between France and Iran, do you think that these types of investment, it seems to be that there's an investment bonanza going on in the EU and France, would that help the party of President Hollande in the 2017 presidential elections?
The Socialist Party is looking for everything to get economic growth restored. Between the euro crisis, now the crisis in China, it is so hard to create economic growth within Europe and particularly within France that this is as good an option as any in trying to jumpstart the economy. It wouldn't be a huge number of jobs, but it certainly would be important and symbolic heading into an election year.
You mentioned the issue of the Iranian diaspora in France, and again, the relationship between the two countries. Aren't you concerned that with these types of investments of Iran with the European Union and with France in particular, that Iran might put pressure on these countries to tone down their criticism of human rights violations, for instance?
Oh, it's critical that once Iran is doing business in France at a significant level, and once major French corporations have corporate interests in Iran, that it becomes, the subject of human rights becomes much more difficult to raise in a public setting. And so it's been easier for France to raise these issues in the last few years. And France, you have to remember, under President Sarkozy, took the lead in pushing for tough sanctions against Iran. So now that it looks like corporate interests are going to be more heavily involved, it's going to be tougher to criticize the regime in an outspoken manner.
So let's go back to the business side of things. It seems that Iran is planning to purchase Airbus passenger planes from jets from France, and there will be other investments, also other businesses. One might think that Europe is opening up to this huge market and the United States is left behind, or the big companies. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is a calculated action by the Iranians, that their interest is to divide Europe from the United States, to divide France, to weaken French opposition to Iran's human rights policy, to Iran's policy in the Middle East, and to sanctions, future sanctions. And so by essentially pursuing a wedge strategy, going to Europe first, rebuilding relations with France, rebuilding economic relations with Italy, it puts pressure on the United States. And so members of Congress will now hear from people that, look, Boeing's not getting these contracts. Airbus is now selling 114 planes to the Iranians. Why aren't we selling our planes? They need spare parts. Why aren't we selling them? This would be jobs for America. And so then you create this cycle where at first there was a focus on the dangerous actions the regime was taking, and now the focus is going to be on jobs back home. And that's one way that Iran's going to be able to manipulate both the United States and Europe at a time when the global economy is slowing down.
Now, should these European companies be concerned that the U.S. Congress might impose new sanctions on Iran that would affect the deals that they're making right now? You mentioned the U.S. Congress.
Well, oh, absolutely. These companies have to be concerned. Their general counsels have to be concerned, because some of these sanctions could have potential impact on their operations in Iran and elsewhere. So they need to watch out, and they need to be careful. It's one of the issues that as we think through our sanctions policy on ballistic missiles, as we think through the future of our sanctions on Iran, we're looking very carefully at companies doing business with Iran, and we're certainly, I think that it's in the interest of America's policymakers to put the toughest possible sanctions in place to prevent future violations of the deal. And at that stage, depending on what these corporations are doing, they could themselves find themselves as implicated in these sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Now, Congress seems to be very skeptical of the Iran nuclear deal, and the leading Republican presidential candidate and also some Democratic presidential candidates are skeptical also regarding this deal. Do you think that it would be wise for the European countries or European companies to wait until there's a new president in the United States and to see what's going to happen before they make these deals with Iran?
I can't see how they can hold off, but there certainly could be a change in U.S. policy that could affect them. Mm-hmm. It's also Democrats in Congress who have been critical of the administration, who wanted sanctions placed because of the ballistic missile program in Iran earlier than the president placed them, wanted tougher sanctions. So it's definitely a period of fluidity. The key question really is the behavior of the Iranian regime. If the Iranian regime moves away from ballistic missile program, if it moves away from aggressive actions in neighboring countries, if it begins to respect human rights, the rights of women, the rights of minorities, the issue of sanctions becomes much less of a problem. It's the character of the Iranian regime that is the source of the sanctions, not political issues in the United States, even if political issues in the United States can affect the size or the magnitude of the sanctions.
And my last question is about this money that is going back to Iran. You think that that would help reform, or that would go stay with the existing elite of Iran and would straighten their hand?
I see no reason to think that that money is going to help promote reform from everything that I've read. It's money that the regime is going to have control over. It's money that is not being targeted either for women's education, for the rights of, say, Azeri minorities, the rights of for going to secular schools. I have not seen one scintilla of evidence that this money is going to go to promote minority rights, human rights, or anything but the regime's agenda. Unfortunately, of course, it comes at a time when global oil prices are so low that every cent of the money is so badly needed that it's actually going to have less of an impact on the country because of the price of global oil prices than the regime would have wanted. But the trickle-down effect is going to be very small, especially in a regime that it seems intent on building weapon systems, seems intent on adventurism abroad. So I would not have much hope that that the money that's flowing is going to make a big difference for the average Iranian.
So you see a long way going.
The great hope for change in Iran was the 2009 Green Revolution. It is a long road towards anything that is going to open up this country in terms of pro-democracy movement, in terms of protecting individual rights and promoting a less aggressive behavior abroad. Unfortunately, it's a sad story, and I'm unfortunately remain pessimistic about internal developments in Iran for the time being.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weinstein.
Thank you.
I appreciate it very much.